One of my first memories of politics was when I was in grade school, and the teacher announced that we were going to elect a class president. Nominations were offered, and the teacher wrote the names up on the chalkboard, and then said, "All right, everyone, put your heads down on your desk, close your eyes," and the teacher listed the names, and you put your hand up to vote for the candidate of your choice. I think we did it lots of times. It must have been part of the governance structure of the grade school that I went to. And I will confess to you that one time I peaked. It was just the right combination. I was somewhere in the room where I could have my head down and I could look through my fingers and give the impression that I really wasn't looking. In that particular election, it was between a girl and a boy. And from what I saw, the girl overwhelmingly got the majority of the votes. And the teacher announced that the boy had won. It was one of those times when winning the popular vote did not actually give you the office that you sought, because the teacher had decided on the basis of who was his preferred candidate, rather than playing by the rules of politics. Now, some would say that's the way politics always are, kind of corrupt and self-serving. But to me, it seems that it was a whole lot more complex than that. I think that this teacher was actually a very good man, and he wanted to do a very good thing. And he chose to use lying and cheating and manipulation in order to accomplish a good outcome. And what about me? I knew what had happened, and I kept my mouth shut. It's true, I wasn't very old at the time, but there is a sense in which I was a co-conspirator along with that teacher. And I wish that I had not peaked. I wish that I didn't know. It did not take very long for the early Christians to be caught up in the politics of their day. Now, of course, they didn't have a vote. It wasn't even like it was in ancient Greece and Athens, where those who were men and those who were free had a vote. No, even the Romans who were free couldn't cast a ballot. And a high percentage, some would say a majority of those in the Roman Empire were slaves, including many of the Christians. But that is not to say that they were not engaged in the politics of their day, in some ways that we would approve of, and some that we would disagree with. We know, for example, that a very high percentage, virtually all, of the Christians in those early centuries were opposed to the common practices in the Roman Empire of abortion and infanticide. We also know that Christians broadly refused to take oaths of allegiance to their country, and many refused to fight and therefore refused to serve within the Roman army. We get a glimpse into how the church that changed the world played out politics in the first century in the story of Paul, who was arrested in Jerusalem and charged with inciting a riot. There were those who conspired to assassinate him, and therefore he was transferred out of custody in Jerusalem to the seaport capital of the province, Caesarea. And there he appeared in court before the Roman governor, whose name was Felix. Felix promised after the trial that there would be a quick verdict, but he dragged it out, hoping that he would get a bribe because he was a corrupt governor. And besides, he kind of liked talking to Paul. He extended 2 years, although Roman law specified that you couldn't hold a prisoner for more than 2 years without giving a verdict, but that is exactly what he did. Paul was a pawn in the politics of Palestine. And then the governor, the judge, Felix, got himself into trouble. There was a civil rights dispute in Caesarea between the Jews and the Syrians. And regardless of what any of us may think of that particular conflict, what happened was that Felix the governor crushed the dissent and did so viciously. So much so that he was reported to Rome and recalled by Caesar back to the imperial capital. And when the emperor found out the terrible things that Felix had done, losing his job, perhaps even being executed, had it not been for his brother Pallas, who was a friend of the Emperor Nero, probably Felix would not have made it. In any case, a new governor was appointed. His name was Festus, and history is kind to him, saying that he was a good man and a just leader. However, Festus had a virtually impossible job. His province was riddled with strife. Uprisings were brewing everywhere. We know that within 6 years, things were in such chaos in the land of Israel that the Roman general Titus swept in and crushed the Jews, destroying Jerusalem and devastating the temple that was there in the center of Jerusalem. Festus was trying, before that happened, to prevent a Holocaust, to lead in a way that was fair and just, to do the job as a politician and as a governor. Which brings us to the challenges faced by politicians in every generation. It's a tough job to govern, because no matter what you decide, there are people who will vehemently disagree with you. No matter which side you take, there are people who will say that you are morally wrong and perhaps morally corrupt. And so I will tell you that personally, I am grateful for those who serve in public office, and I hold them in high regard and high respect. And something that I have chosen is I don't tell politician jokes. I try to give a courteous smile when people say derogatory things about leaders in government and politics, but I try not to perpetuate that type of crude and rude behavior. And I sometimes think, when I hear those who are so severely critical of others in positions of responsibility, if you are so smart, why don't you run for office and do this yourself? But back to St. Paul and Governor Festus and first century politics. Festus arrived in Caesarea, and he moved into a magnificent palace that had been built a generation earlier by King Herod. He knew that his predecessors had failed because they didn't understand the intricacies of Jewish religion and politics, and because they did not have good relations with Jewish leaders. So he did something for which we all ought to admire him. On his third day in the province, third day on the job, he left the palace and went to Jerusalem in order to meet up with the leaders of the Jewish community. And he wanted to be their friends, and he wanted to function well with them. As soon as he met them, they asked him for a favor, which is often what politicians face. The people want something done for their best interest. What they asked for was that the prisoner Paul be transferred from Caesarea back to Jerusalem. Now, I'm actually kind of surprised that Festus, 3 days on the job, even knew who Paul was. But apparently he did. He had been well briefed, and he gave a clever political answer that just bought him enough time to figure out what he should do. But there was something else going on, a secret conspiracy that Festus was not told about. You see, they didn't really want to just have a trial for Paul in Jerusalem. They wanted to kill him en route, and there were assassins waiting. For those who have journeyed with us in this study of the book of Acts, you may recall that 2 years earlier, there were 40-plus conspirators who had joined in a vow to kill Paul. They were so specific that they said they wouldn't eat until he was dead. 2 years is a long time not to eat. So I'm going to assume that they intermittently snacked over the 24 months, but they did not waver on their commitment to have him dead. I believe that Festus wanted to please them so that he could lead them. But I believe that Festus also wanted to pursue justice. But not knowing about this conspiracy, he faced a difficult combination. He looked for a compromise, and he knew that for all politicians, compromise is a necessity in government. He wanted to please the leaders of Jerusalem from the start. So, while he wasn't going to give in to the request to move Paul to Jerusalem, he did decide that he would immediately convene a trial as soon as he got back into Caesarea. The anti-Paul leaders in Jerusalem had it figured out that Festus wanted to curry their favor, that he was predisposed to give them what they wanted. So they assumed that whenever this trial happened, that he would rule against Paul. By the way, that is another challenge that politicians and government leaders frequently face, that they hear out what someone has to say, and then the speaker assumes that listening is agreement and that a promise has been made. And then when that assumed promise is not made, then there is an assumption of betrayal. And it was a setup for all of these difficult things to happen. Festus stayed in Jerusalem for another week and a half, and then he went the 60 miles back to Caesarea and convened a trial for Paul. And Paul's accusers came back as well. They made serious charges that were inflammatory. They raised their voices, but they did not have evidence. People often do that. Those that do not have the facts often shout louder in order to persuade us of their perspective. And probably his accusers assumed it didn't make any difference as long as they went through the routine and as long as they sounded like they were making accusations, that would be good enough. And it often works because, well, sometimes just being loud can in itself give influence. Courts of law and halls of government are especially vulnerable to this tactic. But imagine if you were Paul. You had been kept under house arrest for more than 2 years. And now you are being brought to a trial that shouldn't even be because you have already gone through the entire trial. The judge has been changed and false charges are being pressed against you. And the length of delay is not in your favor. That is why in the United States we have a constitutional guarantee of a speedy trial. Because if enough time passes, then people's memories fade and the whole process becomes corrupted. And Paul must have known what was going on. He was there in the palace talking to guards caught up in the rumor trenches of Caesarea. So he had to know that the governor, the judge, was predisposed against him and seeking the favor of his accusers, that the system was tilted against him. And I think if Paul ever had the temptation to cheat, he must have had the temptation then. He knew that a bribe would work. And he knew that he had enough friends on the outside that he could raise sufficient funds to bribe himself out of jail and out of court. He knew that there were those who would probably step up and testify on his behalf, even if they had to spin their testimony in a way that was not totally truthful. But Paul was not going to do this. He was committed to play by the rules, not because he had unlimited confidence in Roman courts, but because he had an unwavering faith in God's control. He was convinced that a sovereign God was in charge, so much so that he was willing to die. If that's what it took, he was willing to die, but he insisted that he had done nothing wrong. Festus was in a bind. He knew that the charges against Paul were false. He knew that there was no evidence to support them and that Paul was innocent. But if he let Paul go, he would pay a high political price because he would alienate the very people whose favor he needed. So he was sort of stuck between a political rock and a judicial hard place and trying to find out what would be the way out of this. So he proposed a compromise. He asked Paul if he would be willing to have a change of venue, if he would be willing to move the trial from Caesarea back to Jerusalem. Because if Paul would agree to that, then Paul had agreed to that, and it would accommodate the leadership in Jerusalem, and Festus could then make his decision in a different courtroom 60 miles away. But as usual, there was a lot going on behind the scenes. because these assassins were waiting to attack. And Festus was trying to keep everybody happy and be a fair judge at the same time, and that's an impossible combination. And Paul knew that he didn't have a chance if he went back to Jerusalem. On the one hand, there was the risk that he would be ambushed and killed. But even if he went through a trial there, the Romans had an interesting procedure that seems kind of alien to us in our American judicial system, and that is that a judge would hear a case and hear the evidence and then seek the counsel of other people on what ought to be his verdict and sentence. Now, we would call for a judge to be deposed if a judge that was trying our case went out on the streets and asked for email advice on what to do with us. Although we do have an interesting parallel in America, and that is in our Supreme Court, where there are those who file what are called Friends of the Court briefs. So the Supreme Court of the United States, when making very significant decisions, has documents and advice and information that comes from outside counselors to influence them in the decision that was being made. It was routine for a Roman judge to do that. But Paul knew that this new governor judge, when he went to Jerusalem, was most likely to seek the advice of the Sanhedrin, because they were the Supreme Court there in Jerusalem. And on that Sanhedrin were those who were viciously opposed to Paul and wanted him dead. So if he went to Jerusalem, he'd either get assassinated along the way, or he would have a court giving advice that was probably going to end up in his death. So, Paul's response to the Festus compromise was something that took everyone's breath away. You picture the scene. There is the Roman governor seated on his chair with all of the pomp of the imperial government, with soldiers lining the marble-clad courtroom, with a Jewish defendant and Jewish accusers. And Paul is finally given an opportunity to speak. And he says, "I appeal to Caesar." And everyone gasped. They never could have imagined. You see, there was something amazing and wonderful about Roman law. The Roman law figured that you had a good chance for a fair trial as long as you were in Rome or probably in Italy. But they recognized that the farther you went out in the empire, the less the laws would be known and the less control they would have. So there would be incompetent and inefficient and even corrupt courts in the far places of the empire. So the Romans provided protection for their citizens, that they could appeal to Caesar if they thought the court was incompetent. Now that's different from our appeal process. In our appeal process, you go through a trial in the lower court. If you don't like the outcome, you appeal to a higher court, eventually an appellate court, and theoretically to the Supreme Court of the United States. But you got to work your way up. The Romans actually did have another system that was somewhat like that, but that's not what Paul did. He appealed to get out of that court because he figured that he there would not get a fair trial. Appeals were not automatic. If it was known that someone had clearly committed murder or piracy or had committed burglary and was caught in the act with lots of witnesses, then the judge or the governor might deny that appeal. And appeals were risky because Caesar couldn't have everybody in the empire and every court appealing to him, and so the chances were that he would be even tougher if he somehow did not agree with the appeal that was made. But Paul had spent years trying to go along with the system, years that had gotten him nowhere. And so he decided to go all the way to the top. Now remember, Festus is in his second week on the job. 2 weeks he's been doing this. And this was the last thing that he wanted. Because if he sends Paul off to Rome, the leaders in Jerusalem are going to be mad at him. And what is Caesar going to think when the guy 14 days into his job can't adjudicate a small matter like this? Plus, the Roman law required that he write out a document listing the accusations and the evidence, and he knew that the accusations were false and there was no evidence to support the accusations, that Paul was innocent and that the whole thing was a mess. So now, having Paul claim his right to appeal to Caesar, Festus talked to his counselors. They said there's no way around this. And he said, okay, off to Rome you go. But it gets even more complicated. While they're waiting for a ship to take Paul and his guards from Caesarea across the Mediterranean to Rome, some house guests, uninvited, show up and want to stay for a few days or weeks at the palace. And the house guests are a man named Herod Agrippa II, who was a minor king related to the Herod family, but he was sort of the king over a pipsqueak kingdom in an area, the southern part of what we would call Lebanon, and eventually the northern part of today, what we would call Israel. And he knew that he was beholden to the Roman governor, so he came to curry his favor. And he brought with him his sister, Bernice. Except there were rumors rampant that he was not only traveling with his sister, but sleeping with his sister as well. And so they move into the palace and strike up a conversation with Festus, the governor. And Agrippa says, so what's up? What are you working on? And he tells about the case of Paul. And Agrippa says, wow, that's interesting. I think I want to meet this guy. And so he imposes himself and another political agenda into Paul's case. The historian writes it like this. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They urgently requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing to ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there, if he has done anything wrong. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you've appealed to Caesar you will go. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king and said, there is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against these charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear this man myself. And he replied, okay, tomorrow you will hear him. It's a long story. Our time is up. And we're going to have to think for ourselves about how we as Christians engage in politics in our generation. But there are some principles here. To trust God, that's what Paul did. to trust God even when he was up against formidable forces and corruption, to be patient. He waited 2 years and counted those 2 years as a time when he could live faithfully for Jesus Christ. And he exercised his rights for his own protection, but also for the advance of the gospel of Jesus. Paul was headed to Rome. So listen to what he wrote to the Romans. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Dear God, help us in our generation to trust you, to be patient, and to be grateful for the rights that we have as Americans, and to exercise those rights for the cause of Jesus Christ. Amen.